Welcome to the session of literary criticism, where we would be looking into certain other aspects of chapter 14. Before we move on, we would find out what exactly Coleridge had to say, and hence we would have a summary of all the chapters. Published in 1817, Biographia Literaria is considered to be Coleridge's seminal work, which elaborates Coleridge's conceptions of poetry, imagination and creativity based on early philosophical thinking and the 19th century theoretical thought. Coleridge begins his treatise by referring to James Boyer, his secondary school teacher at the grammar school named Christ's Hospital. The years at this school form the basis of his poem Frost at Midnight. Coleridge believes the school to be the place that stifled his creative potential due to formal education. He explains that creativity and intellectual freedom exist beyond the bars of the school windows, and real education can be obtained from experiences from the world outside. He reiterates the need for maintaining relationship with nature, to be able to question and receive answers related to the role of nature in being the teacher of a child. Children, he said, should be given the freedom to roam rather than remain enclosed within buildings. This would ensure the innate freedom of the spirit. Having made the initial introduction, Coleridge proceeds to explain the evolution of his critical precepts. He mentions his early connection with the associationist psychology of David Hartley that holds the view that new ideas emerge from associations inherent in combinations of older ideas. This means that new ideas are inherent in combinations of earlier ideas. Coleridge later refutes this notion because he believes that the human mind is not a mere container for ideas that exist, but an active agent in the perception of reality. Since reality becomes apparent from a discourse with nature, Coleridge arrives at the conclusion that reality is in one way constructed. This pronouncement is more or less similar to Cartesian way of thinking. Coleridge then moves on to define imagination. As I have already mentioned this in the earlier session, he calls it esemplastic power, which is the power that enables the human soul to understand the universe in its raw form or spiritual unity. He believes that the spiritual unity of the universe is the only ultimate object to be perceived, which means that any other objects could be regarded as fancy or the products of other correlative functions of the human mind. After propounding his thoughts on the terms imagination and fancy, Coleridge provides a critique of Wordsworth's poetry. Coleridge asserts that Wordsworth's claim that his poetry in common language for ordinary people is not true. Wordsworth's poetry is as artificial as the poetry of any other poet because it is written consciously by the poet. In spite of the drawbacks in the preface, Wordsworth stands out as an eminent poet, probably the finest of the time. According to Coleridge, Wordsworth is able to transform ordinary natural imagery into the extraordinary. Coleridge explains that his own poetic endeavour is to render the supernatural realistic using natural language. Coleridge rejects Wordsworth's dictate that the language of poetry should be taken from the utterances of men in real life. He asserts that there is no distinction between the natural and unconscious language of prose and the metrical composition of poetry. All language innately possesses meter and rhyme. He analyzes some of the poems of Wordsworth where the use of ordinary language could be replaced by more compelling metrical expressions. To conclude, Biographia Literaria is considered to be one of the most influential principles on poetic creativity and artistic expression. Concentrating on philosophy, Coleridge does not in any way take away the implications of his discussion on creativity. Coleridge's definition of his own creative spirit to be natural, unforced and unpredictable provides insight into his deliberate break with tradition. Let us examine Coleridge's disagreements with Wordsworth. Coleridge differs from Wordsworth on many accounts. The first, what constitutes the real language of life? Second, whether the feelings of lesser educated farmers, probably of the early 18th century, are more genuine than the feelings of people in the higher classes. Third, whether Aristotle's principles of poetry do or do not govern poems and poetry. Fourth, what is to be done about language that is dull and garrulous in everyday conversation, which is still dull and garrulous in poems? Wordsworth appears to refine the language as to say. Coleridge is against refinement of all that is coarse in language because it renders it the same as the language of higher classes. The fifth point, Wordsworth's poetry is about low rustic people, their feelings, ideas that disproves his own philosophic assertions, because Coleridge refutes refinement of all that is coarse in language. The sixth, the rustics focus on facts while individuals at higher levels of education, work and experience focus on the connections between facts and the connection of facts to governing laws, hence focusing on a higher order of thought, ideas, language and conversation. The seventh, these support Coleridge's viewpoint that there is a difference between the language of prose and poetry, while Wordsworth asserts that there is no difference. Let us look into the major concerns of Coleridge's Biographia Literaria in a nutshell. The three chapters, namely 14, 17 and 18, are primarily concerned with a refutation of Wordsworth's theories that poetry should be written in the language of real life, the language of the natural conversation of men under the influence of natural feelings. Whether this is applicable to all poetry or only to a certain kind has never been disputed. Besides, the word real sounds ambiguous. Rustic life is the best poetical material, for in such conditions men live under nature's intimate influence, and there is no essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Chapter 14 deals with the distinction between poetry and a poem, which Coleridge thinks is necessary to analyze before he goes on to criticize Wordsworth's criticism. Chapter 18 is concerned with the language of prose and verse, while chapter 17 deals with the other theories. Chapter 14 describes the complementary aims that Wordsworth and Coleridge set themselves in composing the lyrical ballads. Coleridge vindicates Wordsworth's poetical reputation and asserts his right to attach the preface, since the bulk of the contribution came from him. Coleridge then explains the function of philosophical disquisition as analysis first and synthesis later, and states his proposition that, I quote Coleridge, a poem contains as a prose composition. The difference therefore must consist in a different combination of them in consequence of a different object proposed, unquote. He explicates his organic theory of a poem, namely the interdependence of the parts. This excludes a sequence of dishes like the compositions of the 18th century poets, where each dish is detachable and autonomous. Coleridge puts forward an organic as opposed to a mechanical theory of poetry. We will now compare the views of Coleridge and Wordsworth. Coleridge was indebted to Wordsworth in the study of imagination. Wordsworth concentrated on the practice of poetry, primarily the influence of imagination on poetry. Coleridge is the first critic to study the nature of imagination and evaluate its role in artistic creativity. Wordsworth uses the terms fancy and imagination as synonyms and does not classify imagination as primary and secondary. Coleridge explains the differences between fancy and imagination and the roles they play in creative expression. He explores the division of imagination into primary and secondary imagination and provides fresh insights into their function. Coleridge is the first critic to have given an intense and philosophical explanation to creativity. He gave more importance to the actual process of creation than to the finished product. Wordsworth writes in a subjective manner and examines his state of mind before writing a work. This explains the reason for his love of nature and his position as a true worshipper of nature. Wordsworth believes in a primordial relationship between the mind of man and nature around him. Coleridge, on the other hand, is quite objective. His works are the products of factual and biographical descriptions that surround his life. Wordsworth's writings are highly sequential and logical, and they confine to a single thought process, which is characteristic of his creative endeavors. Coleridge writes in fragments and is unable to maintain a single thought, probably due to the use of opium, for which he was notorious. Wordsworth expresses neither anger nor rebellion in his writings. He does not attack any person or any theory, but seeks to establish his own views. Coleridge, on the other hand, in his Biographia Literaria, dictates some chapters to oppose and assess Wordsworth's ideals. Wordsworth mentions in the preface that there is no difference between the language of prose and poetry, as they both are one and the same. But Coleridge differentiates these two concepts on the basis that poetry comprises of meter and rhyme, while prose does not contain these. Wordsworth, in his preface, believes that a real language that can communicate to the common or rustic people should be the language of poetry. However, Coleridge believes that there is no real language, as language differs based on education, culture, belief, among other factors, but that a lingua communis or common language should be used for poetry. Wordsworth's preface could be regarded as the manifesto of Romanticism because it records the divergent attitude to poetry in the works of the Romantics. But Coleridge's Biographia Literaria is largely an autobiographical work which strayed from its immediate purpose along the course of the work and turned out to be his lengthy philosophic treatise on the creative process and imagination. It also showcased Coleridge's powers as a critic. Wordsworth believes that poetry should contain events from real, common and everyday life. In contrast, Coleridge believes that this feature is too limiting. Wordsworth believes that a poem should be spontaneous and that it should arise out of powerful emotions which are recollected in tranquility. Coleridge believes that poetry deals with the communication of both truth and pleasure, and that some poems may even lack pleasure and communicate only truth. Wordsworth admonishes simplicity of diction and style, which is evident in the preface, but Coleridge is known for the use of convoluted, esoteric and philosophical language in Biographia Literaria. Let us move into the features of Coleridge's criticism. We would analyze the different facets of his criticism. The first one is philosophical and psychological basis. Coleridge was dissatisfied with the existing mode of criticism, and therefore he turned to philosophy and enunciated principles that sprang from the soul and touched the deeper sources of inspiration and creation. That is why Coleridge mentions, I quote him, "Metaphysics and psychology have long been my hobby horse," unquote. He attributes special powers to the human mind and thinks that artistic creation is an inner process. So, he emphasizes on the seminal principle of creation. He makes use of psychological knowledge in defining fancy and imagination, and hence emphasizes on method in criticism. Now, what does he mean by method? Method means an awareness of the relationship between different things and also between different parts of a single entity. T.S. Eliot mentions that Coleridge, with his authority due to his great reading, probably did much more than Wordsworth to bring attention to the profundity of the philosophical problems into which the study of poetry may take us. Eliot was probably referring to the use of poetry and the use of criticism. Coleridge goes to the length of saying that poetry owes its whole charm and all its beauty and all its power to the philosophical principles of method. This was Coleridge's quote. This statement is significant if method denotes unity and unifying power, and that method is similar to the workings of creative imagination. Another facet of Coleridge was the descriptive nature of his criticism. Coleridge applies his own theories of poetry and drama into practice and tries to project their validity. Without his descriptive criticism, his theoretical criticism might have appeared a metaphysical abstraction. His descriptive criticism, in terms of subject, falls into three groups. First, Shakespearean criticism, principally in the 1811 to 1812 lectures delivered on Shakespeare and Milton, as well as various marginal writings, together with chapter 15 of the Biographia Literaria. The second, Coleridge emerges as a critic of Wordsworth in the Biographia Literaria in chapters 14, 17 to 20 and 22. Third, there are a series of miscellaneous comments on various English poets of the 17th century in his lectures, notes and even formal treatises. For instance, the tribute Coleridge pays to Samuel Daniel in the 18th chapter of the Biographia Literaria and Herbert's Temple in the 19th chapter. In this connection, George Watson says, as a descriptive critic, his achievement is brilliant but sporadic and offers no single example worthy to be advanced as a model. No English critic has so excelled at providing profitable points of departure for 20th century criticism. Let us move into theoretical criticism, wherein we will find that Coleridge differs from almost all the English critics before him in his interest in theoretical criticism. No English critic before Dryden had concerned himself with the question of poetic process. For the critics of the 18th century, a poem is simply there, and it is the variety and uniformity of human reaction to it that is worth discussing. For Coleridge, the process of creation is important. The aim of Coleridge as a critic is not so much the analysis of a finished product, but searching for a theoretical certainty. He mentions in chapter 23 of Biographia Literaria that his aim is, I quote Coleridge, to establish the principle of writing rather than to furnish rules on how to pass judgment on what has been written by others, unquote. Coleridge's views of the creative act may be summarized in this manner. The truth that the poet seeks is neither objective, that it exists neither in the mind of the poet nor in what he sees around him, but in the identity of both, the one acting upon the other as a perceptual self-duplication. Coleridge was not without his deficiencies as critic. There are some deficiencies in his critical writings, and these deficiencies are mainly due to the weaknesses of his nature and temperament. He lacked concentration and did not possess the capacity for sustained work. His critical work suffered from lack of system. His style of writing makes it more difficult for the reader to understand him. It is never smooth and holds the quality of the art of conversation. Coleridge's views are too philosophical, which makes him a difficult critic. The fragmentary and unsystematic method of Coleridge was not appreciated by the Victorians. He appealed to a few writers and critics. Some great modern critics such as T.S. Eliot, F.R. Lewis, F.L. Lucas, Ellen Tate and John Crowe Ransom have kept away from his romanticism. In spite of his deficiencies, Coleridge's literary acumen remains unparalleled. I.A. Richards acknowledges that his theory of anaesthesis, later renamed as poetic inclusion, owes something to Coleridge's secondary imagination. The Imagists took over Coleridge's fancy as their territory of inquiry. At this stage, it would be worthy to look into what critics have to say about Coleridge. The reputation of Coleridge as a critic is phenomenal. He is regarded by many scholars to be the best English critic and of course one of the best in Europe. René Vallée believes that Coleridge's critical theories have been borrowed from Kant, Schelling and Schlegel. It is generally believed that Coleridge turned to criticism when his poetic powers began to fail. He says that at crucial points in his writing, Coleridge used Kant, Schelling and Schlegel, reproducing the pattern of senses and the exact vocabulary. In the Biographia Literaria, Coleridge makes a general acknowledgement to Schelling. George Watson comments, I quote him, "The achievement of Coleridge is rightly held to be supreme among the English critics, but no one seeking to expound it can face the critic with much confidence." Unquote. He lays stress on the discursive nature of his critical writing. It is true that in all his critical writings, Coleridge shows a lack of system. Watson observes, I quote Watson, "The Biographia Literaria is as discursive and sporadic in its argument as almost to merits its subtitle Biographical Sketches." The important critical writings of Coleridge include Biographia Literaria, Lectures on Shakespeare, The Friend, The Table Talk, his contribution to Southey's Omniana, Letters and the posthumous Anima Potae. The Marxist critic Friedrich Engels observed that Coleridge's division of the imagination into the primary and secondary draws a distinction between creative acts that are unconscious and those that are intentional and deliberate. We will now move on to some of the views of critics. Saintsbury mentions, I quote Saintsbury, "So then there abide these three, Aristotle, Longinus and Coleridge." Unquote. Another critic, Arthur Symons, mentions that Coleridge's Biographia, I quote him, is the greatest book of criticism in English. Unquote. René Vallée is of the view that Coleridge is a link, I quote, between German transcendentalism and English romanticism. Unquote. Casamia observes, I quote, "No one before him in England had brought such mental breadth to the discussion of aesthetic values." Unquote. R. A. Scott James admires him for his union of heart and head. Herbert Reed considers Coleridge to be as head and shoulders above every other English critic and sees him anticipating existentialism and Freud. To Lucas, Coleridge's statements about imagination are obscure and contorted. His classifications are barren, his judgments nonsensical, his theories windy, cloudy, mysterious. T. S. Eliot pokes fun at Coleridge's metaphysical hare and hounds. Ellen Tate thinks that Coleridge has bequeathed to later generation, I quote him, the fatal legacy of indecision. Before we wind up the session, we will be looking into Coleridge's achievements as a critic. Coleridge is the first critic to introduce psychology and philosophy into literary criticism. He is interested in the study of the process of poetic creation and the analysis of the principles of creative activity. For this purpose, he freely drew upon philosophy and psychology. He made philosophy the basis of literary inquiry and synthesized philosophy, psychology, and literary criticism. His literary theories are based on philosophy. He philosophized literary criticism and brought about a better understanding of the process of poetic creation and the nature and function of poetry. His unique contribution to literary criticism is his theory of imagination. Wordsworth and Addison had examined the nature and function of imagination, but these discussions appear insignificant when compared to Coleridge's treatment of subject. He was the first critic to differentiate between imagination and fancy and between primary and secondary imagination. Through his theory of imagination, he revolutionized the concept of artistic imitation. Poetic imitation is neither a copy of nature nor is it the creation of something entirely new which is different from nature. Poetry is not imitation but creation based on the sensations and impressions received from the external world. Such impressions are shaped, ordered, modified, and opposites are reconciled and harmonized by the imagination of the poet, and it is in this way that poetic creation takes place. Coleridge resolved the problem of the relation between the form and content of poetry. Through his philosophical inquiry into the nature and value of poetry, he established that a poem is an organic whole and that its form is determined by its content and is essential to that content. Meter and rhyme are not pleasure superadded, not merely something superfluous which can be dispensed with, not mere decoration, but essential to that pleasure which is true poetic pleasure. This demonstration of the organic wholeness of a poem is one of his major contributions to literary theory. Let us have a recap of what we have done so far. Coleridge is considered to be one of the greatest literary critics of all times, a scholar of excellent learning, an expert in philosophy and literature with refined sensibility and penetrating intellect. His practical criticism consists of his profound evaluations of Shakespeare and other English dramatists and of Milton and Wordsworth. In spite of several glaring digressions and repetitions, his practical criticism is always illuminating and highly original. It is rich in suggestions of great impact and significance, and his insight of subjects is incomparable. The neoclassic critics judge the works of art on the basis of fixed rules, and they are either legislative or judicial or carried away by prejudices. Coleridge neither judges works of art on the basis of any rules, nor does he pass any judgment, but gives his responses and reactions to a work of art. His criticism is impressionistic in nature. He provides fresh ways of conducting criticism on Shakespeare and Wordsworth, and assesses a number of other old English masters. So far, we have had a comprehensive view, or rather a detailed view, of what Coleridge and Wordsworth had to say about their views on romantic theory, meter, rhyme, diction. After all these sessions that you have heard, we would have questions for you to answer, and these exercises would help you to understand romantic theory as a whole without differentiating either. Of course, the points of difference between Wordsworth and Coleridge are explicit, and it would be beneficial for you to have a thorough reading of all that they have said. Until we meet next time with a new theory, thank you.